Ask anyone what finally broke Japan in the Second World War, and you will get one of three answers. The atomic bombs, the firebombing of Tokyo, the submarine campaign that strangled its supply lines over 4 brutal years. All three are partially right, but none of them is the real answer. Because in the last 5 months of the war, a single operation, launched reluctantly, fought over bitterly, and almost cancelled before it began, sank or damaged more Japanese shipping than every submarine, every carrier aircraft, and every surface warship combined. It did this using just 40 aircraft. It cost the lives of 103 airmen. And when it was over, the commander of Japan's own minesweeping forces admitted that this one campaign, had it started earlier, could have defeated Japan entirely on its own. Almost nobody has heard of it. And the man who made it happen was not a general. He was not an admiral. He was a scientist who studied rocks. To understand what happened in the spring of 1945, you first have to understand what Japan was, structurally, physically, as an industrial nation. Japan was an island. Everything it needed to fight a war came by sea. 80% of its oil was imported, 88% of its iron ore, 20% of its food. Coal, the single most critical resource powering Japanese industry, moved almost entirely by coastal shipping, hundreds of thousands of tons per month, traveling through narrow straits and shallow harbors that connected the home islands to each other and to the occupied territories in Korea and China. 3/4 of all Japanese domestic transportation was waterborne. Cut the sea lanes and Japan did not slowly weaken. It stopped. Factories went dark. Trains stopped running. People stopped eating. The American submarine campaign understood this. From the first day of the war, American submarines had been hunting Japanese merchant shipping across the Pacific, and by 1944 they were sinking it at a devastating rate. But submarines had limits. They could not operate safely in the shallow coastal waters around Japan's home islands, the harbors, the straits, the narrow channels where the most critical traffic moved. The water was too shallow, the minesweepers too close, the air patrols too dense. The inner ring of Japan's supply network, the part that connected the major industrial cities to each other, remained largely untouched, and through it poured the coal and steel and food that kept the war machine alive. There was a weapon that could reach those waters, a weapon that did not require a submarine crew to spend weeks in enemy territory, a weapon that could be delivered at night, from altitude by aircraft that were already flying over Japan every week. That weapon was the naval mine. And the man who had been arguing for its use since 1942 was a Navy commander named Ellis Johnson. Ellis Johnson was not a career military officer. He was a physicist. He had studied at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, spent years at the Carnegie Institution of Washington investigating the magnetic properties of sedimentary rocks, and drifted into naval consulting work because his expertise in terrestrial magnetism turned out to be directly relevant to the design of underwater mines. Magnetic mines detected the distortion a steel ship created in the Earth's magnetic field and detonated when a vessel passed overhead. Johnson understood this physics at a level that most weapons designers did not, because he had spent a decade measuring magnetic fields in places most scientists never went. By the time the war started, he was working as an associate director of research at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. And he happened to be at Pearl Harbor on Navy business on the morning of December the 7th, 1941. That morning changed his career. Johnson came back to Washington and immediately began building the case for a large-scale aerial mining campaign against Japan. He established the Mine Warfare Operations Research Group in 1942, assembled a team of scientists and analysts, and began producing studies that laid out in precise mathematical detail what mines could do to Japanese shipping if delivered in sufficient quantity to the right locations. His numbers were striking. Japan's waterways were narrow, predictable, and heavily trafficked. The choke points were obvious. The minesweeping capacity of the Japanese Navy was limited and outdated. A sustained mining campaign, Johnson argued, could effectively close Japan's most important shipping lanes at a fraction of the cost, in aircraft, in men, in resources, of any other form of attack. Nobody wanted to hear it. The United States Army Air Forces, which controlled the only aircraft capable of reaching Japan's home waters, the B-29 Superfortress, had no interest in using their most expensive strategic bomber to drop mines into the ocean. General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, believed the B-29 existed for one purpose: the strategic bombing of Japanese industry. Every sortie spent on mining was a sortie not spent on destroying factories. His chief of staff, General Lawrence Cuter, was blunt about it. Mining, he said, would divert too many superfortresses away from their primary mission. The answer was no. Johnson kept pushing. He rewrote his proposals. He presented updated data. He found allies within the Navy, most importantly Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, who understood the strategic logic and who had the authority to make formal requests to the Army Air Forces. In November of 1944, Nimitz sent a personal recommendation to Arnold asking for B-29 mining operations to begin in January of 1945, with 150 sorties per month, delivering 600 mines. Arnold gave way, partially. He agreed to a limited program, but nobody expected it to become what it became. What changed everything was a single personnel decision. In January of 1945, General Curtis LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command, the B-29 force based on Tinian in the Mariana Islands. LeMay was not sentimental about doctrine. He had already concluded that the high-altitude daylight precision bombing campaign against Japan was failing. Bad weather, high winds at altitude, and poor accuracy were wasting sorties and aircraft. He shifted the entire force to low-altitude night firebombing, a decision that remains one of the most consequential and controversial of the air war. But LeMay also looked at the mining proposal and saw something Arnold had not. Night low-altitude missions were exactly what the B-29 excelled at. Mining missions flew at night. They flew at low altitude. They required precision radar navigation, which B-29 crews were already trained for. And the loss rates, based on every projection Johnson's team had produced, would be a fraction of the losses on bombing runs over defended cities. LeMay did not just approve the mining campaign, he tripled it. Instead of the modest program Arnold had grudgingly authorized, LeMay ordered the entire 313th Bombardment Wing, 4 groups, roughly 160 B-29 superfortresses, to begin preparing for mining operations immediately. He assigned the campaign a name, Operation Starvation, and he brought Ellis Johnson to Tinian to run it. Johnson arrived on the island and got to work with the intensity of a man who had waited 3 years for this moment. He established Mine Assembly Depot Number 4, 12 officers, 171 enlisted men, and had it stocked with 1,500 mines within a single month. From a standing start on a coral island in the middle of the Pacific, he built a functioning mine warfare factory, and the mines themselves were extraordinary pieces of engineering. Think of them this way. A conventional bomb does one thing. It falls, it hits, it explodes. A mine does something far more psychologically devastating. It waits. It sits on the sea floor, invisible, silent, and it waits for a ship to come to it. The ship's crew never sees the weapon that kills them. They are sailing through water that looked safe 5 minutes ago, that was safe 5 minutes ago, and then the ocean erupts under them and the hull splits and the ship is gone. Johnson's mines came in 3 basic types, and each exploited a different physical signature of a passing ship. Magnetic mines detected the distortion that a steel hull created in the Earth's magnetic field, the same physics Johnson had spent a decade studying in his rock magnetism research. Acoustic mines listened for the specific sound frequencies generated by a ship's propellers and engines. Each class of vessel produced a slightly different acoustic signature, and the mines could be tuned to respond to specific types. Pressure mines, the most difficult to sweep, detected the subtle drop in water pressure caused by a large vessel displacing water as it passed overhead. Imagine a bathtub. When you drag your hand through the water, the surface dips slightly behind your hand. A ship does the same thing on a vastly larger scale, and a pressure mine on the seafloor can feel it. But the genius was in the combinations. Johnson's team could configure over 200 different settings of trigger type, delay, and sensitivity. They built mines with ship-counting mechanisms, devices that let a set number of vessels pass safely overhead before arming and detonating under the next one, turning every harbor transit into a game of Russian roulette. A minesweeper could pass over the mine 3 times and report the channel clear. The 4th ship through would be a freighter loaded with coal, and the mine would kill it. They built mines with delayed arming devices that could sit inert on the seafloor for days or weeks before suddenly becoming active. So a waterway that was swept clean on Tuesday could be deadly again by Friday without a single new mine being dropped. Every minefield Johnson's team laid was a custom-designed puzzle, and the Japanese minesweeping force had neither the equipment nor the doctrine to solve it. On the night of March the 27th, 1945, Brigadier General John Davies climbed into the lead B-29 and guided 4 groups of the 313th Wing toward the Shimonoseki Strait, the narrow waterway between the islands of Honshu and Kyushu that handled 80% of Japan's merchant traffic. 102 aircraft, each loaded with roughly 12,000 pounds of mines and carrying no bomb bay fuel tanks, flew through the darkness toward the most heavily defended waterway in the Japanese Empire. The crews had been briefed by Navy mine specialists, who stressed one point above all others: precision. Every mine had to land in a specific location. The aircraft had to be at the correct altitude, the correct airspeed, and the exact geographic coordinates verified by radar before the bombardier released. If any parameter was off, the mines stayed in the aircraft. The drops required coordination between the pilot, bombardier, navigator, and radar operator working in concert. This was not area bombing. This was surgical placement of underwater weapons at night, at low altitude over waters defended by anti-aircraft batteries and searchlights. Over the next 2 weeks, the wing flew 7 missions and dropped over 2,000 mines into the Shimonoseki Strait and the approaches to Sasebo and Kure. The effect was immediate and almost shocking. The Shimonoseki Strait closed completely for 2 weeks. Not partially, not reduced, closed. No ship moved through it. When Japanese commanders finally began forcing vessels through the mined waters, the sinking started immediately, and they did not stop. Traffic through the strait, which had been running at 70,000 tons per day in March, dropped to 35,000 in April, collapsed to 7,500 in May, fell to 1,750 in June, and by August was barely 1,500 tons per day. Think about those numbers, from 70,000 to 1,500, a 98% reduction in the most critical shipping lane in the Japanese Empire. And here is a detail that changes the entire story of the Pacific War's final months. In early April of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, over 63,000 tons, armed with 18-inch guns, to make a suicide run to Okinawa to attack the American invasion fleet. Yamato needed to exit the inland sea. The fastest, safest route was through the Shimonoseki Strait, but the strait was mined. Yamato was forced to take the longer route through the Bungo Strait instead. And, on the morning of April the 7th, a B-29 flying a weather reconnaissance mission spotted her. Within hours, American carrier aircraft found the Yamato and sent her to the bottom. The mines did not sink the Yamato directly, but they put her exactly where American planes could find her. The most powerful warship in the Japanese Navy was destroyed because Ellis Johnson's mines had closed a strait. Now let me put you somewhere specific. It is June of 1945. You are a merchant seaman aboard a 2,000-ton coastal freighter carrying coal from the Korean port of Busan to the industrial city of Kobe. For months, this run has been dangerous but survivable. Submarines sometimes lurk in deeper water, and there are occasional air raids. But in the last 8 weeks, everything has changed. 3 ships from your convoy were sunk last month by mines that nobody saw and nobody heard until the explosion tore the hull apart. The ship ahead of you in the channel triggered something on the sea floor and broke in half in under a minute. Your captain has been told to continue. There is no coal reaching the factories by any other route, and without coal, the steel mills stop, and without steel, there are no weapons. So you sail. Every minute of every watch, you stare at the water ahead of your bow and you listen for a sound that will be the last thing you ever hear. And you know, because everyone aboard knows, that the Americans are dropping new mines every night, and that the minesweepers cannot keep up, and that every channel marked as clear yesterday might kill you today. When you reach Kobe, if you reach Kobe, you find out that the port is handling 44,000 tons per month. 3 months ago, it was 320,000. The warehouses are empty, the rail yards have nothing to load, and the civilians on the docks are thinner than they were the last time you came through. As Operation Starvation expanded through its 5 phases between March and August, Johnson's team systematically extended the mine blockade from the Shimonoseki Strait outward to every major port and waterway in the Japanese home islands: Kobe, Osaka, Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, then the Korean ports: Busan, Masan, Wonsan, Hungnam. By July, 35 of Japan's 47 essential convoy routes had been abandoned entirely. Nearly 90% of the country's 22 major shipyards were blockaded by mines, meaning that damaged ships could not reach repair facilities. The Japanese expanded their minesweeping force by 349 ships and 20,000 men. They deployed observers on hilltops and fishing boats to try to spot the B-29s coming in at night. They moved anti-aircraft batteries away from cities to protect harbors instead, a decision that tells you everything about their priorities. They considered their harbors more important to defend than their cities. They even sent suicide boats out to deliberately detonate mines by driving over them. None of it worked. The combinations were too complex, the types too varied, and Johnson's team kept changing the configurations with every new drop. The minesweepers cleared barely 17% of what was laid, and every time they thought they had a channel open, the B-29s came back and remined it. The psychological toll was devastating. Japanese merchant crews began deserting in significant numbers. A naval officer named Tadao Kuwahara later told Allied investigators that it became nearly impossible to find men willing to sail. Crews were jumping ship rather than transit mined waters. And why would they not? There was no skill, no evasive action, no bravery that could protect you from a mine. You sailed and you lived, or you sailed and the ocean exploded beneath you, and it was entirely random. That randomness, that complete inability to control your own survival, broke something in the men who had to face it day after day. Japan's leading industrialists, looking at the shipping data, warned their military leaders shortly before the atomic bombs fell that if the war continued another year, 7 million Japanese would die of starvation. Not from bombing, not from invasion, from the simple fact that food and fuel could no longer reach them by sea. And consider the cost. The entire Operation Starvation campaign used only 5.9% of the 21st Bomber Command's total sorties, fewer than 6%. The 313th Wing flew 1,533 mining sorties and lost 15 B-29s. 103 airmen were killed. In return, those mines sank or damaged 670 ships totaling more than 1.25 million tons. In the last 5 months of the war, B-29 mines were responsible for 60% of all Japanese shipping losses. The average mining force deployed against Japan was roughly 40 aircraft, and those 40 aircraft sank an average of 63 ships per month. For comparison, 190 American submarines, operating over the entire course of the Pacific War, averaged 6.9 ships sunk per submarine. Each B-29 in Operation Starvation was sinking ships at a rate comparable to an entire submarine, at a fraction of the risk. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the most comprehensive post-war assessment of Allied air operations, concluded that aerial mining had been the most economical form of warfare against shipping in terms of both men and materials. The Japanese assessment was even more direct. Captain Kyuzo Tamura, the officer responsible for Japan's minesweeping operations, told American investigators after the surrender that the B-29 mining campaign had been so effective that it essentially starved the country. He called it a far-sighted policy. He said that had it begun earlier, it could have ended the war on its own. Ellis Johnson did not become famous. He went back to academia after the war, taught at the Case Institute of Technology, directed a systems research center, and eventually returned to government consulting work in Washington. He suffered a medical emergency during a brain operation that left him with aphasia, the inability to speak or process language. A cruel fate for a man whose entire career had been built on the power of his arguments. He died in Martinsburg, West Virginia. His co-authored study, Mines Against Japan, published through the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, remains one of the most thorough accounts of aerial mine warfare ever produced. Almost nobody has read it. There is one more detail that I find worth mentioning. After the Japanese surrender, the mines that Operation Starvation had laid across Japan's waterways did not simply disappear. They sat on the sea floor, thousands of them, armed and waiting. The Americans needed those waterways cleared for the occupation, but they did not have enough minesweepers in the Pacific to do the job quickly. So they made an extraordinary decision. They allowed the Imperial Japanese Navy, the navy they had just defeated, to continue operating its minesweeping vessels with Japanese crews under American supervision to clear the mines from their own waters. Those Japanese minesweeping units were among the very first post-war Japanese military formations permitted to operate. And they became, in a direct and traceable line, the foundation of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, the modern Japanese Navy that exists today. The weapon that choked Japan's harbors in 1945 created the institution that guards them now. The next time someone tells you that the atomic bombs ended the war in the Pacific, or that it was the submarines, or that it was the firebombing, remember that there was a physicist who studied rocks, who spent 3 years being told no, who watched the Navy and the Army Air Forces argue over whose mission it was and whose bombers would carry the mines, who built his case one memo at a time until someone finally listened. And when they let him try, with 40 aircraft and 6% of the bomber force, he shut down an empire. They told him mines were not a strategic weapon. They told him B-29s were too valuable to waste on the ocean. They told him the real war was being won with bombs and torpedoes. He buried 670 ships with the weapon nobody wanted, and Japan starved.